I'm here with Tanya Short, the leader behind the very successful indie game development studio in Montreal, Kitfox Games. What's remarkable about Kitfox is their commitment to succeeding from making their own games, which they've done from the very beginning with very little work for hire. They're the studio behind Moon Hunters, Six Ages, The Shrouded Isle, Shattered Planet, and the indie game that's making a huge splash right now, Boyfriend Dungeon. We're here to talk about how to build a studio with no savings and create multiple hits. So how about that? Tanya, welcome to the business of indie games.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
And I'll jump straight in to the questions. You've done a phenomenal job of creating a studio with none of your own capital and making it work from the beginning without relying on work for hire. Was that your strategy from day one?
Well, we always wanted that to be the end result. And when we started, we were actually fortunate enough to be part of an incubator that helped us learn some survival strategies, like advice on how to do our own publishing for our own titles, how to identify the value of an IP and how to test it on customers, and how to do a minimum viable version of a game before investing too much in it, that kind of thing. And honestly, my number one strategy from day one has been to actively look for opportunities wherever possible. So like the classic example I use is actually Moon Hunters. So we were in the middle of Shattered Planet development, and we were kind of running late on the beta, as you do, and the team was stressing out. And yet online, I saw this article that was announcing that Square Enix, which is one of my favorite big companies and their products, they were announcing an indie-friendly initiative to help bring more visibility to indie games. But in order to use their program, you had to announce a new game, which we didn't have. Like, we'd already been working on Shattered Planet for 8 months or something. But in the middle of beta development, I said, hold on, I'm going to take 3 days, I'm going to make a pitch, and I'm going to send it to Square Enix because who knows what can happen. And it worked out, and that's great. And so it's a feel-good story. But there's lots of other opportunities that I tried to chase and that didn't work. But I think overall, it's been a huge advantage that we've kept our eyes open at all times, even when we're very, very under stress for deadlines and things. We set aside time for chasing potential new ways of getting ourselves visibility and getting ourselves independence so that we can reach our customers directly.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a really quite comprehensive argument, comprehensive explanation. I can see that you've got some incredible diligence and determination there from you and your team. Could you say a little bit about the sort of detail of what you learned from the incubator in terms of self-publishing and how to test your market?
Absolutely. My background is a game designer, actually. I worked at larger companies for 5 years on MMOs and various things. And I learned that craft. But when we started the company together, none of us knew anything about business or finance. It was kind of the classic, like, Silicon Valley, like, typing into Google, what is a business plan kind of thing. And so the incubator was actually kind of where we learned, okay, this is the purpose of a business plan. This is why you would want investors. These are the problems of taking investment money that you want to look out for. And they also connected me with other indie studio heads that then later would become my mentor. Now, lots of other people get this kind of information without going through an incubator, reading articles online or just at GDC asking for a meeting with somebody you really admire can sometimes create a beautiful mentorship. But the incubator definitely helped us jumpstart that a little bit. And even though we would often get conflicting advice from different experts, it really helped to have a few different options to choose from when we were picking a strategy. And for us, the one that really stuck was was again self-publishing for building our brand slowly over time and trying to eke by as much as possible until then.
Yeah, understood. And how did you do that? And why slowly?
Well, so I say slowly because none of us had. So the reason why none of us used our own capital on investing in our games is because we didn't have any. We were all, I was a very experienced developer. My co-founders were semi-experienced, but we didn't have a huge amount of savings. We all had kind of personal costs that we had to pay. And three of the four of us had, rent we had to pay. So it wasn't really an option for us to use our own capital. And so what we were really looking at is how do we keep paying rent and continue forward on this game. And so the incubator answered for the first 6 to 9 months. Like they helped us survive on a minimum wage for that amount of time. But after that, it was kind of a choice. Like, are we okay with staying kind of far, far below the usual amount of money that someone with our experience would get in exchange for our creative freedom, because we don't have a publisher breathing down our necks and we can decide our own deadlines and we get to communicate directly to the customers through social media and everything like that? Or we could work with a publisher who gives us a lot more money, we're a lot more comfortable, they take off the marketing load, maybe I'm a little bit less stressed. But in exchange, they get most of the followers and they get most of the brand recognition. And they also take a big chunk of our money at the end of it. And we decided to go the more, that's what I mean by the slower, slightly more patient route. Self-publishing is not easy. It's kind of exhausting, but I do feel like it's an investment that's paid off for us.
Yeah, that's great. And what's the exhausting part? Is it like continuously reaching out and sort of hand linking to everybody you can find?
Well, when we started, it was me, an artist, and 2 programmers. And I was doing everything that wasn't art and programming. So I was the game designer, I was the producer, I was the social media manager, I was the PR person, I was the logistics coordinator, finance and bookkeeping. Like I was everything, except for bookkeeping, actually. The artist was a bookkeeper. But it's very exhausting because, for one thing, changing your context of what kind of task you're doing every few hours is exhausting mentally. But also, you don't actually feel like you know what you're doing most of the time. And that's also exhausting because while I'm doing game design, I feel good about myself. I'm an expert. I'm very confident. And then when I have to go write an email to an investor, suddenly it's like, what am I even doing with my life? Like, how can I do this? I'm not even sure. But you try and you get better at it over time. But it definitely feels like a lot. And probably my number one question that my mentees ask me is how I handle task switching between all the different roles that I've had to carry throughout the years. And my answer has always been to try to be 1 role per day. That's something I initially came up with, that like today I am the CEO, I'm doing CEO things, and then maybe the next day I get to be game designer. I'm only doing game design things. Don't talk to me about money or whatever. That's not my job today. I'm just worrying about the systems design or whatever. And that's helped me keep my sanity a little bit, but sometimes you just gotta switch the hats and deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you must rely heavily on your team. You must have a really good bunch.
I have an amazing team. Absolutely. That's probably the number one secret, is work with amazing people.
Because I see you've got a very low churn rate at your studio.
Yeah, we've lost 2 people over the past 6 years. Yeah.
Yeah. It's wonderful to have like a tight-knit group of people working on projects. And then,
although actually, so we've lost 4. It's worth noting that the one time we had to do layoffs of 2 people, so they had to leave against their will, was from work for hire, as a result of work for hire. That's the only time we've had to fire someone. But yeah, it has been a very tight-knit group, and it's been wonderful to grow together professionally.
Yeah, I think it helps that your titles are successful as well, you know, because you can enjoy the success riding the wave together, you know.
Absolutely. And it's difficult because a lot of things, like Moon Hunters, for example, is successful in the long term, but in the short term, it was a little bit disappointing, and it wasn't clear why things were disappointing at first. And we kept investing, we kept exploring, and eventually, not only broke even, but became very profitable. But it did take, a full year of continuing to invest in it before it became kind of the lifeblood of the studio. And so that was a tough, especially those first 6 months were very, very tough emotionally for everybody, where we were questioning everything. And I think it's important for everybody to know that most games that make a lot of money actually take a little while. Like, it's not always that the launch day is this incredible thing that you live off for years. A lot of time it's the long tail, especially on PC, and console, that you keep getting a little bit of money every month, and hopefully with sales and discounts and continuing to talk about it, then you can work it into something your studio can survive on. But the days, I think, of being able to rely on getting a $1 million check on day one are very unusual.
Yeah, thank you. You've got great experience in this area, because as well as build the studio and have a great team, you've also done an amazing job of and the investment hunting as well, but we'll come on to that. You've also done an amazing job of coming up with profitable games that pay the bills, which is every indie's dream. What have you done differently to be able to come up with successive hits?
I think the number one thing that I wish more people would do is actually take off their game design hat and put on their market analysis hat, and spend the couple of days that it takes to really study how much risk you're taking with the idea, the game concept you have. So I don't know about you, but at least for me, and I think most game designers I know, we have 100 ideas a week. It's very easy to come up with an exciting sounding game idea.
Yeah, no shortage of fun ideas.
No, you have lots of ideas, and some of them are really good. So you start building on them, you start making a prototype, and it's very easy to get very caught up in that prototype because there is something special about most game ideas you get excited about. But unless you, again, take off the game design hat, stop thinking that way, and instead start thinking like a market analyst just for a couple of days, and really look at it, really, really study how similar games have succeeded and, more importantly, failed. It's impossible for me to understand how anybody invests in a game without that kind of analysis. And for me, what I mean by analysis is because Steam is our primary platform, I go onto Steam and I look for days for games that have anything in common with the game I'm making, anything at all, whether it's theme or genre or number of players or, ideas, mechanics, anything. And I fill a spreadsheet with how many Steam reviews they've gotten, because I think that's the closest thing to sales that you can easily find with a very quick Google search. And I just fill a spreadsheet with it. And sometimes it's kind of distressing. I don't advise necessarily canceling your game just because you see a lot of games have failed in this way. The important thing is that you understand for yourself what risks you are taking. So for example, Boyfriend Dungeon, when we started it in March of 2017, there weren't very many close competitors that had sold at all, but there also weren't many that had failed at all. There just weren't very many. In March 2017, all of the dating sim games were either pure visual novel, or they were very erotic, and targeted towards straight men very clearly, or they were completely ridiculous. Like they didn't even have like humans really. And so when we looked at that market analysis, we thought, well, we don't know if this game can be profitable. There's literally no sign. There's not a bunch of failures. There's not a bunch of successes. We don't know. And so we made the decision to take a certain risk on it, but it was a small risk. We said, okay, we're going to try it for a few months and then announce it and see how it goes. But if we hadn't done that market analysis and just plowed forward, I think it would have been very, very foolish. Even if at the end of the day it would have worked out, I think you need to take responsibility for every dollar you invest in a game that you're trying to bring to fruition.
Yeah, no, that's great. Wow. And so what would have given you the signal to carry on with Boyfriend Dungeon if you didn't have the data and you were being responsible for that money? What gave you the faith to sort of carry on with that?
For us, it was the faith that we could get to a point where we could create enough of a prototype to make an announcement video that we could then test the market with that. Basically, we felt like at a minimum viable, at the smallest level, we could deliver, and it would be acceptable. It wouldn't sink the studio for us to make the smallest possible. And then, it's kind of surviving until the market test, and then change our plans from there. Luckily, very soon after that whole market analysis and green light decision, Dream Daddy was announced, which was very exciting for us because it's maybe the most comparable game on Steam. It's still very, very different. It doesn't have dungeons or combat or anything like that, but it was still something to give us hope that people want to see humans, handsome humans, in their Steam games sometimes. And so we were very much encouraged by that. And then the announcement went really well, and it's a happy story. But I think in an alternate universe where we were able to strive to make the little mini prototype, and we announced it and it didn't do that well, it still would have been an okay investment because making back a little bit of money is relatively easy. And then we could go back to the drawing board and try again to find something that has maybe more evidence in the market analysis for there being an audience.
And what sort of evidence did you get? Was it like views of the video and popularity of the video? And
so the initial announcement teaser trailer got pretty viral. I think it's our most watched video to date. Actually, it has 100,000 views, and it was covered on random news channels and things like that. It was very, very popular. And that gave us some courage. And then we did the Kickstarter a year later, again, to market test and make sure, well, is it just a joke or will people actually give us money for this? And so it was a second market test, which also came back pretty positive. So it's good. It's good. But for all of our games, no matter what, we're always going to do this kind of market analysis to initially greenlight and then do a market test before we fully go all in, because otherwise there's no way to know. You can't go by your own gut instinct, you don't know how it's going to do. I mean, you never know how it's going to do, but at least you can understand how risky it is.
Sure. I mean, for my own part, having been in the Boyfriend Dungeon many times myself, I could, even from the name, I had an idea that it might be successful.
I hope so, but you always hope so.
So that research is very interesting. And I mean, so far, it's just a wonderful strategy that you've used. And you're really leveraging the tools available online to find out what your market is and then reach that market. You also seem to have done wonders with finance as well. It's very difficult oftentimes to get publishers to part with the big money. I've had many dealings myself where people like, or players like Activision will have said to me, well, you know, we'd like to give you a shot, but we only invest in studios that have already had a hit and who have already had a hit in that certain genre. So getting funding, clever ways to get funding is even more and more important today. You've done a great job of securing low-cost loans on a project level and from government VCs and development funds. How have you done this, and how has it worked for you?
Well, we always took a relatively pessimistic approach. I think the number one thing that I was told over and over again was to assume your game will sell very, very low, especially your first few. So when we went into starting to launch Shattered Planet, and the team was stressing out about, you know, getting the build ready and fixing all the bugs and things like that, like, most of my time I spent with them, we were talking about bugs and shipping, but privately, all of my actual work time was being spent chasing money, because I had to assume we would only sell, you know, 100 copies. And if we wanted to survive, then I needed to find something else. So by that point, we had announced Moon Hunters. And so a lot of my time was going towards working on a Kickstarter. That was one source of income. That was also when I was pitching government VCs, which is a weird Canadian thing that I don't know how internationally applicable that is. But there were these VCs using government money to give little startup loans, and I think startup programs exist in a lot of places. So it was just a small amount, like 100,000. So Kickstarter, that little startup program. And then we also started chasing little work for hires. Now we kept it relatively small, like a work for hire that wouldn't take the whole team and wouldn't take that long, but it would still be income. And so we did a very small web game for Cartoon Network, actually, for Steven Universe. It was a little Tetris-y game where you're cleaning up his room. And it only took one programmer 1 month, and it gave us, you know, $30,000. And that's not enough to live for the studio. But basically, my answer is that before launch, before we had run out of money, I was already kind of flailing on the internet at all the possible sources of income that wouldn't limit us. Because what those three things have in common, Kickstarter and the government, the startup program, and the work for hire, is that none of them would stop us from making the game we wanted to make. They would all help us make the next game, which was Moon Hunters. And, you know, sometimes it involved a little bit of exaggeration. Like when I was talking to the startup programs, I had no idea what our 10-year plan was, but I had to make something up that was possible. I think I told them we were going to make an MMO by now, but just don't tell them about that. I mean, I still would like to make an MMO, to be honest. I miss working on it. But anyway, I think looking forward and seeing when you're going to run out of money in 6 months or so, that's really when you need to start panicking and start thinking really hard about what you're willing to give up in order to continue to survive, and figure it out before it's you know, the chopping block.
And you know, thank you. And with the sort of the government money, do you have to give up less, and is it easier to come by?
So the startup program, it still required some know-how. That was definitely the money that I feel the least confident in understanding how I would get it again. Like if I were to start it all again and start another company, the government is very opaque, and I don't know. The programs seem like they change every few months. But that's definitely where finding a business mentor in your local area can be really helpful, even if they're not in your industry. Like if there's a software developer in your area, maybe they can introduce you to somebody who knows somebody who's heard about startup programs. For us, I think it was that we were newly incorporated, and we were all under 35 at the time or something. Like there were various random requirements, and I had to go in with a pitch deck and pitch them and whatever. But yeah, the main thing is to ask your local bureaucrats, I guess, what's available.
Thank you. Great. And would you say that the Kickstarter stuff, the Kickstarter money was the most helpful then?
The Kickstarter money was it was the money that sort of pushed us over into being able to actually finish the game. I think if we hadn't gotten that, we would have had to go searching again after 6 months or a year or something. But the most important thing about the Kickstarter was actually the visibility and the connection with our audience, because at the end of the day, money you can get from a lot of different places, but I think actually building a fan base is a lot harder in some ways and more difficult to replace. KitFox has been trying to build our brand alongside our game brands, by, for example, centralizing our social media under the KitFox label, not having a different one for each game. And again, self-publishing is part of that strategy, but I think the Kickstarter also was, both of our Kickstarters, for Moon Hunters and for Boyfriend Dungeon, the primary value for us was actually as direct us to consumer marketing, where we could really be people to them that they care about, and they could continue to engage with us and talk with us and feel like they knew who KitFox was, and it goes beyond just the game. So I haven't yet done the analysis of exactly how many of our Boyfriend Dungeon backers were also Moon Hunters backers, but I do know there was at least some overlap.
Thank you. And what advice could you give to indie devs coming through who want to do their own Kickstarter campaign? What do you bear in mind, from a development perspective and also from a communications perspective?
Well, there's a lot of advice out there about things like how to calculate your shipping costs and things like that. Overall, I think the number one thing that surprised me was realizing that the brand of Kickstarter and what people think they're doing is they're helping the underdog. They think that they're putting money towards somebody that's struggling and overcoming and challenging themselves and that kind of thing. In reality, most backers aren't interested until they think you're going to succeed. They want to back a winning horse. They don't want to give money to something that seems like it's not going to work and work out. And it's this weird catch-22 where you have to sort of fake it till you make it a little bit, and that like, this is definitely going to work. We're definitely going to do this. And you have, and like, get people on board with your excitedness, even though you're not sure if it's going to work and you're not sure it's going to succeed, because it makes them much more likely to band together behind you. And I think, again, it is also highly advisable to look, rather than at the Kickstarters that succeeded, really dig deep into the Kickstarters that failed that are like yours. They're much harder to find. People delete them, and Kickstarter doesn't want to show them to you because it's bad for their brand that Kickstarters fail and everything like that. But it's absolutely essential when you're planning your Kickstarter to really, really look for the failed Kickstarters. They almost always have more to teach you about what you could maybe do a little bit better than the ones that succeeded.
Thank you. Did you pick your funding level very carefully? I've heard people say, like Mr. Kickstarter, who helps people with their campaign, says it's very difficult to get more than $100,000. Yet, of course, there are the anomalies like Ashes of Creation that get overfunded for millions of dollars. What's your thought?
Well, the average Kickstarter backer and the average consumer has no idea how much money it takes to make a game. And honestly, they're just going by visuals. So for us, when we talk to consumers in the mainstream, if they see a 2D game that's just hand-drawn graphics, they believe it costs less, and they believe it should cost less, and they don't see why it should be funded for over a certain amount either. So it's an interesting side effect of what art style you pick as well, that you might not even realize at the time. and different genres will also come across as different values to the customer. And I think for us, we picked an amount that we felt we could achieve within 48 hours. Again, for that cycle of wanting to win as soon as possible and get people, look how successful we are, kind of thing. For that feeling, we picked a lower amount than we felt we could get, because we didn't want it to be a struggle at the very end. We wanted it to be successful as soon as humanly possible without looking like too shady. Like if we'd only asked for $2,000, I think there'd be a little bit of like, what is this campaign doing? But
you just borrowed
45 and 55,000, like that felt like an amount that the average consumer says, oh yeah, that's an amount that you make games for. Obviously not, but it's still an amount that seems meaningful and yet achievable within 48 hours. And then for us, it ended up only taking 6 hours, thankfully. But
well, that's fabulous. That's fabulous. And did you communicated to your existing fan base as well as the Kickstarter community, of course? Yeah. Was there a lot of preparation getting that community together before you launched the Kickstarter?
Yeah, even for our first campaign, for our very first Kickstarter, for our first big game, Moon Hunters, almost nobody knew about us because Shattered Planet was our first game and didn't sell that great. For Moon Hunters, we announced it, and then we had 6 months of trying to get people on our newsletter, of trying to boost it on social media, and preparing the Kickstarter. We had about 6 months of community building before we launched the Kickstarter, which absolutely helped, for sure. It was essential.
Yeah, great. That's really clear. So you talked about leading on Steam, but you've also done stuff on PlayStation and Xbox. Is that to a lesser extent? And did you get a publisher for that, or did you self-publish as well?
We self-published for each one. We found our very first employee hire actually was an amazing programmer, Marcelo. It was this amazing programmer, and he had been toiling at this other place that didn't appreciate him. So we took him, and his dream was actually to bring a game to the consoles. He had never worked on a console game before. Now it turned out that he by himself ended up porting the game to all the consoles for Moon Hunters after it came out on PC, and it was a great life goal for him. I don't know if he wants to do that again, but. But it was just Marcelo, and it's kind of amazing now, actually, how much more accessible the consoles are than they were 10 years ago.
Yeah, of course.
You can have one person port a game to a console, and it's actually possible. The PlayStation and Nintendo and Xbox, they all now see the value of having indie games on there, and so they make it a lot more easy. They have a lot more documentation of varying quality. We did hire a couple of contractors to quality assurance to check through the certification requirements, but only for, I don't know, a month or two each. We've only put Moon Hunters on all three, and then the Shrouded Isle on Switch as well. But we haven't announced any consoles yet for Boyfriend Dungeon. We're still sorting that out.
Yeah, great. Did the Switch version do well for you?
It did. And actually, the Shrouded Isle did surprisingly well, even though it was a year later. So Moon Hunters came out very, very early in the Switch timeline, like in its very first year. So of course, it did very well. I do recommend getting on a console in its first year of life whenever possible. But the Shrouded Isle, considering that it's a smaller game, more niche, in my opinion, it also did very well for coming out just this January. And we did have one publisher. There was a regional publisher. So we have a publisher, Kakahashi Games in Japan specifically. So Zach from Kakahashi handles our PR and press and publishing to consoles in Japan, and he's very, very good at it. And actually, weirdly, the Shrouded Isle did as well or better in Japan on Switch than in North America, which
right.
I I've never heard of any other game doing that. But
really, usually it's very territorial, isn't it? The markets are different. And well done, congratulations to you.
Thank you. Yeah, localization has been a big part of our ability to succeed. I think it's added. It's the rumor is that it adds 15% revenue, and that's definitely been true for us.
Yeah, I've always found that eFigs, and then it's kanji. We've done it rarely, on our titles.
Chinese is getting like really big on Steam. If you're interested in being a PC developer, if you're an indie, get some Chinese in there, because it's I think it's our #2 region right now.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you for that. Another very useful insight. Thank you. What do you find now the most challenging thing? Is it still the juggling hats, or what?
Well, I actually, in some cases, even identifying which of the hats I want to delegate and which ones I want to keep can be a little difficult, because I actually enjoy some of the things that I used to complain about. But I think for us, now that we're entering our 6th year, where we're having our 6th birthday at the end of the month.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Well, now we're in the stage where we're having a little bit of a midlife crisis, I guess, because we're surviving, we're succeeding, but now all 3 founders who are remaining, we all are kind of questioning, like, what do we want to do? What are our ambitions? What are our longer term goals? If survival is still here and we are making our own games, do we want to make bigger games? Do we want to make more risky artistic games? Do we want to get paid more? Do we want to live in Japan? I don't know. We're all kind of questioning our what we want to do with this amazing fortune that we've had. So we'll see how things go in the next few years, but it's possible that we maybe form 3 different KitFox coalitions or something. Coalitions or something.
Wow, really? Okay.
I mean, if we have different goals, we have to see. I think it's part of my job to help my co-founders achieve their goals as well. So
yeah, of course. Yeah. And, I mean, is there a current strategy for the next 3 years then, or are you formulating that now?
Well, that's sort of what we're formulating. The long-term goals get harder and harder, I think, as you realize that your constraints are shifting or changing, and the market changes. So yeah, I'm mostly head down in Boyfriend Dungeon, but there is the beginnings of rumblings of like, well, what about after that? Like, what is actually our long-term goals? And we're not sure anymore, because we only really plan for 5 years. So
yeah, understood. Great.
Ask me again in a year or 2, I guess.
I will do, if you'll let me. I would like that very much.
Excellent.
And so, what do you have any 3 lessons learned, or 3 pieces of advice, or 1 piece of advice for indies going forward? Lessons learned.
I think I'm often disappointed by the number of indies that decide that they must burn themselves out, like they must work so hard that they need months and months of recovery afterwards. I've always approached KitFox from the very beginning as something that was a marathon rather than a sprint, that we were going to do it for 5 or 10 years, and therefore we needed to take care of ourselves. And I think it is tempting, especially for your first couple of games, to think, well, the whole company's riding on it. It might not survive till tomorrow. I have to give my lifeblood to this thing, or else I'm being irresponsible. But I actually think it's really important to step back and have the discipline, the self-discipline, to really ask yourself, is it responsible to not be at my sharpest on tomorrow or next week or next month? Can you afford a 4-month vacation? Because that's what you're going to have to do if you haven't been taking care of yourself, and you haven't been eating, you haven't been sleeping, and you haven't been, I don't know, taking weekends. And so I actually think most indies need to kind of reverse their thinking on what is responsible, and really look at the medium term of how do I survive the next few months without burning out or burning out my co-founders or my employees or whoever you're working with. Because I think taking care of yourself is actually really important to the company in the medium to long term. So yeah, it's difficult, because I do think we have a culture, not just in games and not just in startups, but just in Western society in general, that our work is our purpose and we have to give everything or else we're bad. But
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
have to treat yourself. I mean, you're an animal, right? Like
yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree. I agree with you. You know, I know one thing. After 23 years in this business, there's always another milestone. You know,
always, always,
yeah.
always. Like, even if you think shipping is finishing, it's not. Like, you after shipping, you also have to do a million things. You can't.
Well, we have live ops now, right? So
Yeah.
you know, we can have downloadable content in real time if you want.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, so it's a great philosophy, and hopefully the industry is going in more that direction. You know,
It seems like it. It's definitely. I started a petition, or not petition, but a personal pledge 5 years ago now, I think, of people saying when I crunch, I'm failing in some way. Like it's maybe not the best, the only failure or the most important failure, but it is a failure when you crunch yourself and burn yourself out. And I remember I started it at the time because one of my most admired game designers and game leaders in the field, who's very, very famous, had said that crunch is inevitable, that you can't avoid it. And that offended me so deeply that I was like, no, well, first of all, it's one thing to believe that, but it's another to think that it's okay to say that to young developers who look up to you. And so then I had to create this pledge, and I remember at the time some people were like, well, I don't know, sometimes it's actually useful and blah. Like, it was a whole debate. But now I think actually you're right that things are changing a little bit. I get almost no pushback on it whenever I bring up, like, stop burning yourself out, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
I don't get a lot of people arguing with me anymore.
I mean, you know, we're in a Western civilized society. You know, surely, you know, our commitment is to keeping each other, you know, growing, and keep each other well, and keeping each other developing. You know?
Yeah.
I remember.
Yeah, you're not of any use to anybody if you burn out and can't make games anymore.
Yeah. I remember. I think it might have been 15 years ago. When I first saw an open letter from the wives of the developers at Electronic Arts.
That's right. That's right.
Can we have our husbands back? You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was Erin Hoffman, I believe. She's still very active in game development, I think.
Great. Yeah. Maybe I'll go and Google the archives for that one.
Yeah.
So I just got a couple more things to ask you, if that's all right, before we.
All right.
And is there anything that you would do differently, having in this? Because it's not just the 6 years; you had the previous years as well, working at developers. Anything you'd do differently?
No, I mean, working at the big studios was definitely a huge asset. I think if somebody's not sure what they should do, definitely I would start at a big company, get some experience in network, and then go indie personally. But everyone has their own path. No, for me, the thing I would definitely do differently is, and I've given a full speech on this, but I was reacting very negatively to people in the indie space not planning their productions very well. And there was a lot of advice going around like, well, just take your estimates and multiply them by 10, and then you have a ship date or something like that. And yeah, like that's not a production practice. Like that's ridiculous. And so I became very prideful and convinced that it was my duty and important that Moon Hunters be developed according to schedule, and that we would do it we would deliver on time, and we would not have very many delays and all that kind of thing. And unfortunately, unlike I think the stereotypical indie who takes an extra 10 years or whatever, I am more likely to be tempted to do the opposite and ship just a little bit too early, because I was obsessed with the schedule. I was obsessed with shipping on time. And so if I could go back, I would delay Moon Hunters. It took a lot of analysis to figure out what we messed up with the launch, but definitely an extra few weeks or months would have made a huge difference and cost a lot less tears in the long run, even if it would have hurt my pride a little bit to delay it at that point after I'd been so loud about people having production practices and things like that. So that's my main learning that I've had going forward, is being aware of my own weaknesses and my own failings and accounting for them and trying to sanity check major decisions like when to launch a game. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We all have our learning curve, and you've done a fabulous job there.
Thank you.
So excited to watch, the developments with you guys. Are you playing anything yourself at the moment?
I am. I actually just started playing Banished, which is a little town building game, very relaxing. Kind of reminds me of SimCity in some ways, where you start out just kind of organically building your little place, and then at some point the infrastructure is not really working and you start over and you're gonna do it better the next time. And yeah, I'm enjoying Banished right now.
Great.
But I'm looking forward to getting into Heaven's Vault as well, which is an alien archaeology linguistics game that is by one of my favorite developers, Inkle, who also made 80 Days, which is one of my favorite games of all time. So yeah, I'm looking forward to Heaven's Vault next for sure.
Great, thank you. I've really enjoyed our session today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I really hope it helps someone.
Great, yeah, no, I'm sure it will. Our audience are going to love this. I really appreciate it. Thank you.